Welcome back. Now, the debate on the size and activity of South Africa's informal sector has been raging on. The discussions were brought about by alleged disparities in the nation's employment statistics. But Julia Hampton from the Oxford Department of International Development warns of the dangers of the myth of a large informal economy. She joins us now for greater insight. Thank you so much for your time, Julia. Now, firstly, when we talk about the informal sector, what criteria are we looking here for a business to actually qualify as informal?
So measures of informal businesses vary to great degrees, and so did the definition. We have small, medium, and micro enterprises. We have a newer definition of emerging enterprises, which could just be one person with something less than 10,000 rand turnover. It really varies, and I think it really depends what you're looking for. But the discussion, as I understand it, is basically looking at anyone that earns a livelihood through informal channels. So not through formal wage work.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's really been a big debate about the contribution of the informal sector. What's your observation then of the GDP contribution and role of the informal sector in the labor market?
So, while South Africa does have a big informal sector, we definitely don't have a big enough and uncounted and visible informal sector, as per Capitec CEO Jerry Fourier's claims that say that South Africa's unemployment rate is so heavily overstated, is something more like 10%, because of the massive amount of people that are earning significant livelihoods through informal channels.
Okay, that's quite interesting. So basically, would you say that the myth here is that there's a big invisible portion of the informal market when that is not the case? And does that also mean that when it comes to the data collected by Stats SA, there isn't some big portion of the market that is uncounted, that everything is visible?
Yes, so I think that's one of the bigger components of this myth and why it's captured such imagination and public sector debate, is because of this trope of it being invisible to the formal sector, particularly to the state, with people coming out in defense of Capitec's data. But just to make it clear, the quarterly labor force survey that measures whether people are self-employed or not does count people who are self-employed. It doesn't totally miscount them. And also this data has been the methodology of collecting this data is specifically designed to be nationally representative according to basic statistical premises of representativeness, whereas other private data from banks, for example, hasn't been designed to be nationally representative. This data will have it'll be totally weighted to overrepresent people who are banked and therefore people who are earning an income. So of course it would appear as if more people than actually are earning informal livelihoods. The concept of the informal economy, which emerged in the 1980s, was first coined by an anthropologist called Keith Hart, and he was talking about people doing informal, unregulated work in Ghana. And this concept really captured scholarly, public, and political imaginations across the world, in particular in international development circles and in South Africa. South Africa's had what are called enterprise development policies since the 1980s. So really it began under the apartheid era state, but then really picked up with the African National Congress in the democratic era. We've had iteration after iteration of enterprise supply or enterprise development programs to try and promote this concept, because it's a very appealing concept, because it relies on this notion that everyone has agency and people can kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and that if their natural energies are kind of unleashed, then they will be able to look after themselves and get by, and this unemployment issue won't be such an issue anymore, and the state doesn't have to provide as much social security, which is a drain on the fiscus, some people argue, or active labor market policies and job creation policies. So it really kind of takes the pressure off state, civil society, and business from dealing with the problem. However, in South Africa, despite these big efforts from both this government and international development programs, and also business programs for corporate social responsibility and shared value that are all around this idea of informal traders and small businesses kind of capturing value or sharing value from global supply chains, despite these programs, South Africa's informal sector just isn't as big as it is elsewhere on the continent and elsewhere in what is often called the global south. And this is for historical reasons. Since the colonial era, people were dispossessed of their land, as we know, but there were also many other regulations to basically pressure, especially working age men, to go and work on mines, on farms, and in factories. So to basically repress informal activity and repress subsistence activity. So this historic repression plus a historic dependence on formal wages, which in the past were more prevalent, jobs were more prevalent in the past. Scholars have talked about the shift from a labor shortage economy, where there was all this effort by the colonial and apartheid state to try and attract work and also recruit workers from all over the continent. From the 1970s onwards, it's now what is called the labor surplus economy. And this often gets talked about in South African debates as a policy failure or domestic issue specifically, but it's actually not a distinctly South African issue. Much of the global south and much of the world, also in what we might call first world countries, are also experiencing similar issues with deindustrialization, but also more broadly structural shifts in the global economy where traditional sources of work have been eroded and workers have been shed in the millions across the world. So South Africa is a particularly stark case of this phenomenon, where we have some of the highest unemployment rates in the world, but it's not alone.
You know what? It's quite a shame that when we overstate the scale of the informal sector, that's actually when we fail to address the real core structural problems. What stance then do policymakers need to take in viewing the informal sector and supporting it?
So, of course, the informal sector should be a concern of policymakers. And already there is, as I said, much being done to support this. So there's myriad enterprise development programs such as business acumen training, microcredit, enterprise supply development training, where people not only get aided with regulation, because there's a lot of regulation in the informal sector. Some may say too much, and that makes it too difficult and also too expensive for small businesses to pay the fees to get the right registrations. So there's a lot of support there. But I would just caution against putting too much of the focus on, as I already said, on informal sector activities. And there's so much that can be done to address unemployment more broadly, to create jobs and also to provide social security. So I think when we talk about support to the informal sector, we have to couple that with an acknowledgement that jobs need to be created and social security should be destigmatized and is always going to be an important bedrock of any healthy society.
All right. Well, we do have to wrap up the conversation there. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights on this very, very important topic, and of course, quite a controversial one it has been over the last few weeks. Julia, much appreciated. That was Julia Hampton from the Oxford Department of International Development.